For Canada and Mexico, that means a 25% tariff on all exports.
Subsidies that we're giving to Canada and to Mexico in the form of deficits.
U.S. inclusive, of course, of energy production, and that pertains to oil, as we were just.
The Donald Trump era has begun in the U.S., and the entire global balance has changed. Trump announced surprise tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the U.S.'s biggest trading partners. These tariffs will be imposed on Canada and Mexico by 25%.
We'll be announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico for a number of reasons.
This signaled the beginning of a very different process for both countries and the global economy, especially the confrontation between the U.S. and Canada, which share the world's longest international border, after Trump's moves on tariffs became the focal point of the agenda.
The implementation of these 25% tariffs on the U.S.'s closest neighbors and biggest trading partners on Saturday, February 1st. Now, to your point, Alex, he had suggested already that February 1st was kind of a deadline.
So what was Canada's reaction to these shocking tariffs announced by Donald Trump? Has the Canadian government announced any counter moves against U.S. President Donald Trump? What changes will await us in the international economic arena after these critical tariffs? We will discover the answers to all these critical questions together. We will discuss what is happening between the U.S. and Canada, the impact of Trump's tariffs on both countries, and the predicted consequences of this situation. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. Let's start with Canada's reaction after U.S. President Donald Trump announced the tariffs. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he had discussed the issue with provincial leaders.
President Trump said that he wants to usher in a golden age for the United States,
and emphasized that President Donald Trump's proposed 25% general tariffs on all imports from Canada, which could take effect on February 1st, would affect every region of Canada. Mr. Trudeau, who recently resigned as Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party, said officials were working around the clock to prevent tariffs. Later, Justin Trudeau said that his government is preparing a strong and united response if the U.S. imposes tariffs on Canadian goods, and signaled a joint effort with the EU. This striking statement has become Canada's clearest and strongest statement against Trump's tariff rhetoric. However, the main point to note here is that the primary impact of Donald Trump's tariffs is the oil relationship between the two countries. Canada exports 80% of its oil to the United States and imports half of its oil from Canada. Canadian energy also powers homes and businesses in the United States, especially in New England, where Quebec exports hydroelectric power. And Canada ships other important goods to the United States, such as potash, which is used in fertilizer, and uranium, which is needed for nuclear power generation. If Mr. Trump follows through with the tariffs, the repercussions will depend on how sweeping they are, or whether some Canadian goods, such as oil, will be exempted. Experts predict the initial impact will be negative for all three countries, which are bound by a free trade agreement known as the USMCA. Not only is it unclear exactly which items Mr. Trump will target and how Mexico and Canada will react, but the consequences could vary over time, including an increase in inflation as goods become more expensive, job losses, and a chill in spending as consumers worry about reduced incomes. Governments often intervene to mitigate some of these negative effects. On this issue, Canadian government officials have indicated that they will consider bailing out businesses and supporting the hardest-hit workers. As the Ottawa government vowed to retaliate against American trade tariffs, U.S. President Donald Trump lashed out at Canada. Trump said the U.S. does not need imports of oil, gas, vehicles, or lumber from its northern allies. Trump made the comments in his first address to world leaders since returning to the White House for a second term. Trump shared his harsh criticism of Canada and reiterated his threat of tariffs. According to Trump, Canada has been very difficult to deal with for years, and it's not fair to Trump that the U.S. has a deficit of $200 or $250 billion from its relationship with Canada.
$200 billion plus a year. Our military is at their disposal. All of these other things.
Donald Trump called the trade relationship between the two countries hostile and unfair, and blamed Canada's import policies for the U.S. trade deficit. In a speech at the White House, Trump criticized Canada's increasingly protectionist plans for his country, arguing that Canada is unfairly profiting from its trade relationship with the United States. Trump's comments sparked widespread criticism among political leaders north of the border. Many are divided over how best to defend against the threat of sweeping trade tariffs. Canada, in particular, is preparing to relaunch plans to retaliate against the U.S. for its decision to reduce oil exports. So, what can Canada do in response to Trump's decision to reduce oil imports? Canada's arsenal of possible responses to Trump's tariffs includes suspending, reducing, or threatening to impose export tariffs on Canadian energy. The mere suggestion of such a tactic has caused a split between the Alberta government and the governments of Canada and other provinces. Tariffs on U.S. imports have the potential to hurt some industries and regions. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has acknowledged that the impact of Canada's import duties will be diminished by the size of the U.S. population and economy.
Is that immigration is a source of opportunity.
Stopping or tariffing Canadian resource exports has the potential to cause real and generalized discomfort in the United States. But as we understand it, it would also impose huge costs on Canada. But can Canada absorb most of the consequences of this threat? In fact, the Canadian economy has proven remarkably resilient to the pandemic recession, and more recently, to one of the most synchronized global monetary tightening cycles in decades. Canada's recovery from the worst recession since the Great Depression has been markedly faster and stronger than previous recessions, and more recently, the recoveries of its global peers. Canada is well positioned, both economically and institutionally, to manage the currently high levels of global uncertainty and a complex geopolitical landscape. So we are talking about a country that is strong in the face of U.S. leader Donald Trump's decisions to increase tariffs and reduce oil imports. Contrary to the widespread view that containing inflation will inevitably lead to a recession, the Canadian economy has had a soft landing. For all of 2024, inflation remained within the Bank of Canada's target range, and price stability was achieved in most sectors. Importantly, growth slowed as the Bank of Canada intended and did not lead to the widespread job losses that many feared, putting our economy in a favorable position for a healthy recovery. Responsible fiscal management helped the Bank of Canada return the policy rate to neutral levels. With stable inflation, the government can continue to pursue strategic investments aimed at supporting productivity and raising living standards. Against a backdrop of global economic uncertainty, the government's economic plan has laid a strong foundation to drive growth now and in the years ahead. Of course, Canada's dynamics are not entirely sufficient to withstand U.S. tariffs and changes to oil imports, because we are talking about two countries that are completely entwined economically. And as everyone knows, the U.S. economy is much broader than Canada's economy. That said, there is reason to believe that Canada's trump card in a trade war is not what it will avoid buying, but what it will avoid selling. It is also worth noting that oil is not the only resource card Canada holds to close the economic gap. Experts point to the willingness of many northern provinces to cut electricity exports on which they are heavily dependent. Unless the U.S. exempts crude oil from its general tariffs on Canadian imports, such a move by Canada would be pointless anyway. Economists believe that tariffs on potassium, critical minerals, steel, and aluminum will also put pressure on the new administration. These materials are among the elements that U.S. industries rely on to integrate with Canadian producers. In this tariff war, the impact on Canada and the administration's retaliatory decisions are important, as well as the implications for the U.S. side of the situation. First of all, if there is a reduction in Canadian petroleum products shipped to the U.S., it will be difficult for Washington to rein in the prices of this energy source. Oil prices are such a critical issue for U.S. leaders that researchers at Stanford University tracked 30 years of polls and found that, on average, A U.S. president's approval rating drops by 0.6% for every 10-cent increase in the price of a gallon of gasoline.
The national average for a gallon of gas today, that's $3.82, about where it was a year ago, but 68 cents higher than 2 years ago.
This effect persisted through the 2024 elections, with 3 in 10 voters in contested states citing gas prices as their top priority. When gas prices rise, consumer confidence falls, and so does the share of voters who say the country is on the right track. But would Canada make this kind of oil move to undermine Trump's political power? Couldn't refiners replace Canadian imports with crude from other countries? To answer these questions, it is important to understand how the U.S. refining sector became dependent on Canadian crude in the first place. An important fact is that while the country is vulnerable to Canadian oil disruptions, it is not because it does not produce enough oil for its own needs. It is important to remember that Canada produces more than it needs and is a net exporter. For the U.S., the problem arises in the conversion of all this crude oil production into usable gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. The U.S. has around 130 refineries with the capacity to refine more than 18 million barrels of oil per day. But there is a mismatch between these refineries and the type of oil the U.S. produces. In the 1980s and 90s, there were widespread fears that oil was running out. U.S. production was falling, and so the refining industry redesigned itself to be able to process Latin American oil, mainly from Venezuela. Venezuela has the world's largest known oil reserves. Most of it is bitumen-heavy crude, which is difficult to refine and difficult to get through pipelines unless it is diluted, just like the oil sands in Alberta. Then early in this century, new technologies such as horizontal drilling led to a U.S. oil boom in Texas fields, such as the Permian and Eagle Ford, and in North Dakota's Bakken. The shale oil produced in these fields is lighter and sweeter than Venezuelan or Canadian crude, and has less sulfur, and therefore theoretically easier to refine. But many refineries had invested in expensive technology designed to process heavy crude, and their business models depended on the price discount they demanded for such oil, which sold for a few dollars less than a barrel of light, sweet crude. Much of the U.S. shale oil began to be exported to overseas refineries that were better suited to process it. U.S. crude exports have risen from less than 1 million barrels per month in 2009 to well over 100 million barrels per month these days. The U.S. also continued to import foreign heavy oil. The rise of the Chavez regime in Venezuela in 1999 caused an exodus of petroleum engineers and a massive drop in oil production, upsetting the long-term plans of the U.S. refining industry. Fortunately, Canadian oil sands production was increasing at the same time as Venezuela's was declining. The next quarter century would see the proliferation of pipelines and transportation networks in the U.S. designed to refine heavy Canadian crude. Many refineries, especially in the Midwest and West, are completely dependent on Canadian imports. If Canada turns off or tightens the taps, or simply raises the price, these refineries could theoretically source similar heavy oil from other suppliers. In practice, however, both political and economic considerations would make this difficult. In November 2022, the U.S. government eased sanctions against Venezuela, and Chevron returned to the country.
Y lo hacemos en Estados Unidos, que ha reimpuesto sanciones a los sectores del petróleo y del gas en Venezuela.
But this relaxation was conditional on Nicolas Maduro allowing democratic elections. The Biden administration began withdrawing licenses in 2024 as it became clear that Maduro had no intention of allowing a free and fair vote, and today, very little oil is flowing. Now, according to experts, Donald Trump could lift the sanctions altogether and allow Venezuelan crude to flow once again to U.S. refineries. But there are important reasons to believe that Trump will not do so. Donald Trump probably understands the importance of Magazuelans and other anti-communist Latino voters for his winning coalition in the state. It is also hard to imagine that Trump's new Secretary of State, the Cuban-American Marco Rubio, would want to start by lifting sanctions against the Maduro regime. And in any case, Venezuela's makeshift industry is only a shadow of what it was before the socialist takeover. Venezuela produces a total of less than 1 million barrels a day, most of which has already been promised to China. For the U.S., Venezuela's daily production can never replace the 4 million barrels a day that Canada exports to the country. So we can see that there is no viable alternative in this situation. This impasse could even lead to a shift in focus to Colombia. Colombia's heavy sour Castilla oil or Mexico's heavy sour Maya oil could be refined in the same plants that process Western Canadian crude. But Colombian production is not enough, and Mexico is moving forward with a strategic plan to refine its heavy crude in its own facilities. That leaves sources like Russia and Iraq, both of which produce heavy crude. But while Trump is more than happy to lift the price cap on Russian oil due to the invasion of Ukraine, these countries face another problem. This affects all non-Canadian suppliers. They are trying to figure out how to get their oil to U.S. refineries that can handle it. But couldn't U.S. refineries simply reorganize to handle light crude from their own shale fields? Couldn't they stop importing crude from Canada and stop sending their domestic crude to refineries in Mexico, China, and the Netherlands? They could do that, but the cost would be very high, and the transportation problems, while not as insurmountable as sourcing crude from overseas, would still be serious. Such a restructuring would take time and would most likely not bear fruit until well after the next midterm elections in the U.S. This possible course of action would therefore do little to prevent the political impact of Canadian action. In fact, a few pockets of industry in the United States might welcome a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico. For example, American growers of tomatoes and other seasonal fruits and vegetables who are struggling to compete with their Mexican counterparts could be protected from the effects of these tariffs. But most industries would be hit hard by the economic disruption of such high tariffs. Even groups that might prefer more protection against Mexican exports, such as U.S. auto workers, could be hurt if tariffs suddenly cause auto supply chains to grind to a halt. Both the United Auto Workers and the United Steelworkers International Union also cross the U.S.-Canada border and include members in Canada. This means that they are generally opposed to any restrictions on Canadian exports. The bottom line is that a reciprocal tariff war between the U.S. and Canada has the potential to have a profound impact not only on the two countries, but also on the global economy. Economists hope that both the U.S. and Canada will consider these potential negative consequences. While it seems unlikely at the moment that Trump will take the first step and cancel the tariffs and import reduction moves against Canada, this problem needs to be resolved urgently. On the Canadian side, it is obvious that U.S. leader Donald Trump's retaliatory moves against tariffs will not ease tensions between the two countries. In short, we may face a crisis involving the U.S., Canada, and even Mexico for some time to come. Thank you for watching.